Hi, I'm Jack Hansen, and I'll be presenting on An Act of State, the Execution of Martin Luther King by William F. Pepper. Today we're going to be discussing the assassination, starting with who William Pepper is himself and his qualifications to write the book. We're going to be talking about the state's case that they presented, involving James Earl Ray as the sole shooter. Then we're going to talk about Pepper's case, which is a more conspiracy-based thing, and the premise for this whole book. Then we're going to discuss the issues that I personally have with the book, and finally we're going to talk about what conclusions I drew after reading this book. So William Pepper began his lawyer career in 1977 when he passed the bar, which was the start of his professional career, but prior to that he was an academic, particularly over anti-war issues, and he connected with MLK in a professional capacity as well as a personal one. He considered him a close friend. Not to drag his politics into this, but he was very far left and active with communist causes, which has some bearing on this case, so I thought I'd mention it. He worked on the MLK assassination for most of his life, from 1978 to 2000, which is when final court proceedings were dropped, but he has since published and has still been active with the case in the years to follow. Additionally, he's been active with 9/11 conspiracy theories in a professional capacity and has represented Sirhan Sirhan in parole hearings, trying to get him released in 2012, and working with him up to 2016 when the court declared him ineligible for parole on those specific grounds. All right, to begin with the state's case for who killed Martin Luther King Jr., they name James Earl Ray as the lone gunman, motivated by racism exclusively. After they caught James Earl Ray, he pled guilty, so the case did not go to trial. But in 1978, the House Commission on Assassinations sort of ran their own thing for it, and they did confirm the official story in their report. This is the same commission that confirmed the results of the JFK assassination. So here's the timeline of the theory. It all takes place on April 4th, 1968. So at 5:55 p.m., MLK steps onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. 6 minutes later, at 6:01, James Earl Ray fires a single .30-06 bullet, which hits him in the neck and will later kill him. At 6:01, immediately after firing it, Ray flees from the boarding house with all his stuff, and at 6:03 drops a bundle containing the rifle and binoculars in a rolled-up tablecloth in the doorway of a shop nearby. Then at 6:05 he gets in a white Mustang and drives away. A manhunt is called, and 2 months later he's arrested at Heathrow Airport and extradited, following a massive manhunt. That's his mugshot after he returned to Tennessee. Following talks with the DA, he would plead guilty, and was locked up until he died. This is a map of the area with the relevant details labeled. We've got Green Star there, which is the Lorraine Motel balcony where MLK was shot, and that blue star is the bathroom window from where it's believed that James Earl Ray fired. The only other relevant thing here is Jim's Grill is located in the same building as the bathroom where James Earl Ray fired from. That will become relevant soon. All right, so now we're going to discuss the Pepper case, which, compared to the state's case, is incredibly complicated and convoluted. It names a wide-reaching web of conspiracy that involves multiple government agencies and organized crime. In a courtroom setting, it was heard unofficially in a TV trial orchestrated by Pepper, and then it was later heard in a civil case filed by Coretta Scott King and members of the King family in 1999, with Pepper as the lead prosecution. In 2000, the jury ruled that King was killed as a result of governmental conspiracy and awarded damages amounting to the requested $100 to be used towards King's funeral expenses. So let's begin with some of the key players. We've got Lloyd Jowers. He owned Jim's Grill, and he is sort of the central figure in here. The case that was filed in 1999 was against him. It was a civil case against him. He was sort of a bagman for the weapon and the money, a go-between between all these people. And we've got Frank Liberto, ostensibly a produce stand guy, but really a local mobster, connected all up with the gun-running operation that was orchestrated by Raul. Raul, from the beginning, has been this shadowy figure. It was Pepper's research that uncovered him as a Brazilian immigrant, a former auto worker, and in the eyes of the government, that's all he is. But further details confirm him as a gun runner who worked in Houston for most of his life, moving to Dallas for this operation. And he had taken on the contract for MLK's life. I don't really want to get into the contract in this presentation because it's incredibly convoluted and based on evidence that is not super backed up. But the long and short of it is that the money comes from New Orleans. It's not quite clear from who. But in his past, Raul is connected to covert ops through his arms dealing. Basically, the guns were thought to be stolen from army bases, really given to him by covert ops. And then he turned around and delivered those to different groups throughout Latin America. And then we've got the military intelligence group. It's sort of an umbrella term for a bunch of covert ops that are involved in this, specifically the Alpha 184 sniper team, technically called the Alpha 184 reconnaissance team, but they were snipers that had trained for a month for the assassination. They thought that they would be assassinating an Arab target somewhere in the Middle East, but it was revealed to them prior to the mission that they would be going to Memphis. And then we've got the 902nd Military Intelligence Group, which is a covert PSYOPs, that's psychological operations team, which was used for reconnaissance. Finally, we've got Earl Clark. He was an MPD officer who likely took the shot. We'll talk about more of that in a second. All right, so here's this timeline. It's super complicated, but let's get into it. So in the month leading up to all of these events, Frank Liberto, the mobster, coordinates some planning meetings in Jim's Grill that are attended by 5 MPD officers, including Mitchell McCullough, I believe, who went undercover with MLK. He was in the hotel at the time of the assassination. McCullough was actually working for the MIG, but he was sort of double agenting to the MPD and then was going undercover through the MPD into MLK's group. All right, then on the 2nd, Raul gives Lloyd Jowers the rifle and a bundle of cash. He's supposed to deliver the cash to whoever kills the guy, and ends up leaving that in a room and later discovers it missing. The rifle he will leave in Jim's Grill under the counter in Jim's Grill up until the moment of the assassination. On the 3rd, MLK arrives in Memphis. At the airport, he's expecting to see his usual detail of black detectives, but they do not arrive. Instead, some white detectives show up who are very hostile, and MLK dismisses them and says he doesn't want the protection. On the 3rd, coinciding with this, 2 members of the 902nd Military Intelligence Group arrive in Memphis with weapons and camera gear, and they keep a low profile until the assassination. At 4:30 a.m. on the 4th, 8 members of the Alpha 184 sniper team enter Memphis dressed in civilian clothes, and they will set up in a bit for the assassination. Now at 11:45 a.m., the 902nd Military Intelligence Group team goes and talks to the fire chief at the fire station, which is just right down the street, and they set up on the roof with their camera gear. An hour later, the Alpha 184 team is in position on the roof of the Illinois Central Railroad building, which is a ways down the street. Half of them are there, the other half are in an unknown location somewhere else. At 5 p.m. that day, Raul tells James Earl Ray to leave the rooming house. Now, James Earl Ray is staying in the rooming house to help Raul with a gun-running assignment, he believes. James Earl Ray is a convict. He's used multiple identities over his life, has just undergone plastic surgery to change his face, and is recently re-entering the crime world, helping out with some stuff. But Raul tells him get lost and go see a movie. Tries to get him to leave his car, but unbeknownst to Raul, James Earl Ray takes the car with him. Then, at 5:40 p.m., Earl Clark and the other group from the MPD, all these conspirators, they go to the bushes behind Jim's Grill, and Lloyd Jowers joins them with the rifle. 5 minutes later, members of the Invaders group, this is a black militant group who's providing security for MLK, they're kicked out of the Lorraine Motel. They're told that their bill is not paid, but that doesn't quite track with how hotels work. So super conspicuous, but they leave, and they're out of there by the time that the assassination happens. Then at 6:01 p.m., three things happen. One, Earl Clark shoots Martin Luther King with a single .30-06 bullet. Two, the Alpha 184 team freaks out because they think that both teams think that the other team jumped the gun and shot him. And the 902nd Military Intelligence Group takes some photos of the assassination, but then also apparently capture photos of the assassin. These photos never come to light. At 6:01 p.m., 20 seconds later, they say, Lloyd Jowers already has the rifle and has already hid it under the counter in Jim's grill. He runs inside in all of a flustered mess, covered in mud. Then, at 6:08 p.m., James Earl Ray, who's at a service station with his car trying to get a tire changed, trying to get the spare tire changed, rather, finds out the cops are looking for him because he hears sirens and hears on the radio that they're looking for him. And he takes off in the white Mustang, flees, and eventually will be caught at Heathrow Airport. So that's the timeline as presented by Pepper and as confirmed by the court in the civil case. So this is the updated map. We've got the green star on room 306, which is where Martin Luther King died. We've got the blue star where Ray shot from, but according to this version, Ray was not even there. He was at an entirely different location. Then we've got the purple star there, which is the fire station where the military intelligence group was set up to take photos, and way down the street, but from a very elevated perspective, so well within the range of these guns, we've got the pink star, which is where the Alpha 184 snipers lie. So after that timeline has been established, I had some issues with it, and I'd like to get into them now. Issue number one is that Pepper continually mixes evidence and conjecture, and he doesn't always point out which one is which. He's prone to introduce some solid evidence conducted by that he's gained through interviews or whatever, but then he'll pivot into his own opinions. A very good example of that is where he offhandedly presents, and for no reason really, presents that J. Edgar Hoover is gay, which is a very contentious point historically, but he presents it as fact with no evidence to back it up. And that's an example that he does throughout the book. Secondly, his sources usually have their own agendas, and they often present conflicting testimony between subsequent interviews. So over the years, he worked with these people for 20 plus years, and their interviews spanned 30 plus years. And they change their minds all the time, and he kind of just sets that aside. Third, Pepper discredits his critics unfairly and ignores a lot of the events that happened to him. One instance of this is he went on ABC to discuss some of the military links, and he said that a certain operative had been killed as part of a cover-up. ABC then brought on the covert operative to shake his hand, and it was a hugely embarrassing moment for Pepper that he neglects to put in the book. His critics are painted as co-conspirators and stooges for the government and never given the respect that they deserve. Although he does present the state's case in full as an appendix to the book, and does cite many of his interviews in full, which I appreciate. Fourth, and maybe the most problematic from the perspective of building this case, across the board, he never allows financial gain to be seen as a motive for lying to him. Several of the people in this book were very poor and made a lot of money by conducting interviews and selling book deals and stuff like that. And so obviously this gives them incentive to juice up their story. But he sort of dismisses that and says it can't be financial gain. They must be being coerced or whatever. And yeah, so those are my issues with the book. But here are my conclusions. The state's case is cohesive, but if you really look at it, the evidence of a cover-up is pretty obvious. The most glaring example of that is that the pre-dawn on the April 5th, the day after the assassination, members of the police force asked the local janitor people to cut down all the bushes out back of Jim's grill, thereby destroying any evidence in that whole part of the yard. and it had never been cut before. So this was just a bizarre occurrence that to many is clear signs of a cover-up. Pepper presents like an insane amount of evidence. This is one of the longest books I've ever read, well over 1,000 pages. And it supports his theory across the board. And so one kind of has to think that if he was able to collect all this information, a lot of it must be true. And that's compounded by, because again, I have a lot of issues with how he narrates the story, but he's really good about having different witnesses independently verify things. So the thinking is that if all of them independently verified these things, if all of them could independently point to a conspiracy, then it must, to some extent, be true. But regardless, those are my conclusions that I drew from this. Obviously, it's a case with a lot of gray area, a lot of conflicting evidence. I'm happy to answer any questions about the things that I glossed over because, again, it's a huge book, a lot of detail in it. But that's all I've got. Thank you for listening.